Hello, everyone. Welcome to our EconPodcast, Principles of Economics. This lesson will be mostly about fiscal policies involving aggregate demand and aggregate supply model. So, if you do recall, as we describe our macroeconomic model, we were to track various stages of macroeconomic growth in terms of GDP, inflation, and unemployment. So let's quickly try and review those macroeconomic growth stages. So here we have a recession, a point of intersection between aggregate demand and short run aggregate supply that gives us a short run equilibrium. The GDP is lower, meaning that it is below potential GDP. Inflation is lower, and unemployment is higher because the economy is not doing well and people are out of job. And then when there's a shift of aggregate demand to the right, we reach full recovery in the long run equilibrium. GDP reaches potential GDP. Inflation is increasing and unemployment reaches natural rate of unemployment. As aggregate demand continues to shift to the right, we reach another equilibrium described as inflationary economy. If you notice, at that inflationary equilibrium, GDP is higher than potential GDP. Inflation is a little bit higher and not acceptable, and unemployment is decreasing. So these are the three stages that will be the focus of fiscal policies. So we'll begin with recessionary policies, Keynesian approach. As indicated here on our model, this is our recessionary gap. Low GDP, high unemployment, low price level. As aggregate demand shifts to the right, eventually we reach potential GDP full recovery in the long run. So the question is, what fiscal policy can move us from a recession economy to full recovery? And that is what a recessionary policy is trying to accomplish, to move us from recessionary economy to full recovery. So as indicated here, what we're trying to accomplish to move from a recession to full recovery in our policy implementation. So how do we begin to understand fiscal policy in recessionary gap? First, you have to know what is the economic situation. It is a recessionary gap, meaning that the equilibrium level potential is a little bit below potential GDP. The second thing that we have to know is the metrics to identify the economic situation. We are in a recession, therefore GDP is lower, we have a high unemployment, and we have a lower price level. Well, now that we know what is the economic situation and how to describe it with those metrics, what policy conceptual framework that we will use to move ourselves from recession to full recovery. From the demand perspective, Keynesian approach, we will use our understanding that GDP equal consumption plus investment plus government plus net export. So with that policy conceptual framework, how do we translate that conceptual framework into a policy prescription? Here it is, policy. So here, since we are trying to shift our aggregate demand to the right, that means that GDP will increase. If we want to increase GDP, and know that GDP is made of consumption, investment, government expenditure, and export. Here we will do what is needed to increase consumption, investment, government expenditure, and export. In order to accomplish that, the policy here will be to decrease income tax. When you do decrease income tax, you have consumers having a little bit money in their pocket to spend, and therefore consumption will increase. If you decrease business taxes, companies will have a little bit of money in their account to spend in a business. Therefore, it will increase business investment. And as government attempt also to help, the government will also increase some expenditure in the economy, and that will cause government expenditure also to increase and help the economy. And eventually, that can have a positive impact on net export and increased net export too. As a result of those policies, we will have our aggregate demand that is made of consumption, investment, government expenditure, and net export. That aggregate demand will shift to the right towards potential GDP. So this is the policy prescription by which we can increase consumption, increase investment, government expenditure, and net export, and that will cause our aggregate demand to shift to the right towards potential GDP and grow the economy. Now let's look into inflationary policy with the Keynesian approach. So here again is our graph, our model, okay, and this is our recession equilibrium, recession gap, and as aggregate demand move to the right, eventually will reach full recovery. And as aggregate demand continue to move to the right, we reach another point of equilibrium. And what is interesting with that equilibrium is that GDP is greater than potential GDP. And something else, price level is a little bit too high and not acceptable. And for that, that equilibrium is understood to be inflationary gap, where GDP is above potential, unemployment is lower, but the price level is a little too high. So the question here is, what fiscal policy can move us from inflationary economy? And as you can see here again on our diagram, inflationary policy is to move us from inflationary gap to full recovery because of the price level. So the first thing to consider as you're trying to look into your policy is the economic situation. it is an inflationary gap where equilibrium on of the output is a little bit above potential GDP. And the metrics to identify the economic situations are higher GDP, low unemployment, and not acceptable higher price level. The policy conceptual framework will be the same, which is GDP equal consumption plus investment plus government expenditure plus net export. With that policy conceptual framework, how do we craft a policy prescription? And here we are again, knowing that our policy conceptual framework use a GDP made of consumption, investment, government expenditure, and net export. So in our policy prescription, we will first try to see how we can influence consumption. And because we want to come from inflationary gap to full recovery, we need to decrease consumption in order to shift aggregate demand to the left. And to accomplish that, if we increase taxes, consumers will not have enough money to want to spend a lot. So that will cause consumption to decrease. Similarly, since we increase business tax, businesses will not have enough saving in the account and will not have some incentives to want to increase investment. Therefore, investment will decrease. Government expenditure will be also decreased, and that will cause a decrease in the government expenditure component of our GDP computation. And eventually, those policy of decreasing income tax, business taxes, and the government expenditure decreasing can cause net export also to decrease. And as a result of those components decreasing, we can observe a shift of aggregate demand to the left towards potential GDP. And that is exactly what we're trying to accomplish because when we do that, even though GDP might decrease a little, but what we're trying to really target is price level. So as there's a shift coming back to the left towards full potential, price level will decrease, which is exactly the objective of this policy. The next lesson that we will look into will be money and banking and monetary policy.